Right, so hi, my name is Megan. I am currently a recreation technician for the Boise National Forest in Idaho. And for my master's project, I coordinated with them in fulfilling a need that my forest had by applying for grant funding to address trail maintenance issues. So recreational infrastructures, such as trails, are suffering from a backlog of deferred maintenance on public lands from a lack of funding sources. The allocation of recreational funding, it really varies across the United States from agency to agency and district to district, but most areas are seeing unsustainable cuts to their recreational budgets. As we just continue to see these cuts, and as recreational demands increase, land managers are struggling to get much needed work done on the ground. In addition, when fire season begins, funds are funneled from recreational budgets to help cover the cost of fire management. So these funding cuts and fire borrowing force recreational staff to apply for additional funding from outside sources. Federal agencies will continue to apply for grants until federal funds are better distributed to match forest needs and other agency needs. So, the local problems. The north side of the Boise National Forest has over 890 miles of trail ranging from wilderness, trails within the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, to a network of ATV and motorcycle trails throughout the forest. Of these trails, 208.2 miles are non-motorized. A large number of these trails are currently in disrepair and virtually non-existent. I applied for grant funding to address deferred trail maintenance issues on approximately 40 miles of non-motorized trail located on the Emmett, Cascade, and Valley Ranger districts. But the annual trail rotation schedule identifies 80 miles scheduled for this year. The other 40 miles will continue to be deferred because of the lack of funding resources. The Boise National Forest faces continuous trail maintenance challenges resulting from widespread wildland fires, extensive tree die-offs, and increasing recreational pressures. These additional factors, compounded with existing deferred maintenance issues, cannot be addressed by volunteers and partners alone. Without supplemental funding and personnel, the forest trail program will be unable to address and prevent resource damage. This is where it's located. So what was done? I applied for and received additional funding through the Southwest Idaho Resource Advisory Committee to increase the amount of non-motorized trail miles available for recreational use within the north zone of the Boise National Forest. A partnership with a conservation crew, American Conservation Experience, was established and will be utilized to carry out project goals while also providing youth with the opportunity to connect with nature through employment in a backcountry setting. Volunteer groups such as the Treasure Valley Backcountry Horsemen and the Southwest Idaho Mountain Biking Association, or SWIMBA, will also be utilized. So, I'm getting into my methods. First, I determined that the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreational Trail Program grant that I originally planned on applying for wasn't the best funding option to pursue based on the time of year the grant proposals were due and the limitations that they set on how the funding could be spent. I decided to apply for the Southwest Idaho Resource Advisory Committee grant instead. This grant proposal wasn't due until March, which allowed me more time to produce a well-written grant. So I analyzed existing use by looking at data recorded from National Visitor Use Monitoring surveys. And this helped me justify why the funding was necessary. So based on the 2014 NVOM survey, it's estimated that the Boise National Forest receives 756,000 visitors a year. And of these, 87% of users come from the local area. 37.4% of total users were participating in some form of non-motorized activity, which is up from 2009, where that was at 34%. So this information shows there's an increasing demand for recreational opportunities on the Boise National Forest non-motorized trails. So I conducted interviews and pursued guidance from the Boise National Forest grant writer, the North Zone Recreation Specialist, the North Zone Trails Foreman, and the ACE Director. I also developed a good working relationship with non-motorized user groups and gained their verbal and written support for my grant proposal. I worked with them in developing a cooperative volunteer agreement to help me with the funding match requirements for the grant. I also obtained the required letters of support from the Gem, Boise, and Valley County Commissioners for my grant proposal. So through research, communications with ACE, and working with the local recreation staff, I was able to determine how much funding to apply for. It was suggested by a RAC committee member that we not request much more than $20,000 because of how the committee allocates funding to support various projects. So requesting this lower amount helped us to secure the total funding that we requested. I worked with the ACE director to keep our budget within the recommended amount while also making sure that we could fund the ACE crew long enough to fulfill the project's goals. We were able to fund an ACE crew for 4 weeks by asking for a total of around $25,000. Other funding sources include appropriated dollars from the U.S. Forest Service at $5,840 to help cover monitoring costs, and we also use that as a match. ACE matching funds of $19,500 and 80 dedicated volunteer hours, which amounted to $580 in-kind donation. This was from the Treasure Valley Backcountry Horsemen's Association, as well as the Southwest Idaho Mountain Biking Association. So for writing an interview, I just wanted to hit on this as the last part of my methods. So I compiled the information over several months. After I collected the background information, I developed a proposal outline. I had the first draft written the first semester in December, and that was reviewed. It took about a month. This gave me the opportunity to discover if there was anything that I had overlooked or if I needed to do any further research. I had the second draft completed towards the end of January and submitted the final draft for approval on February 25th. And this is while I had the March 7th deadline. That way I could get it to my supervisor for review and submission by that date. So the status of my grant is that it was accepted and approved by the committee, and now the Trails Foreman is in the process of working on the final agreements. So the funding can be used to contract the ACE crew to carry out the non-motorized trail maintenance project. These agreements must be accepted by the Forest Service so the funds can be distributed and the project can start. So ensuring that the public has safe access to hiking, camping, mountain biking, horseback riding, hunting, fishing, and all other non-motorized activities can help to develop strong environmental ethics and inspire people to support the conservation of our national forest lands into the future, as well as keep recreational impacts off of surrounding resources. So overall, this project was a success. I learned a lot of valuable lessons. You really don't know where your life will be in a year. Things can change really fast, so it's important to be flexible. I started off doing research and planning for one project, and then right as I was starting the writing process, I was directed to pursue a different grant. So this is a really stressful time for me, but it wasn't as difficult as I thought. I just had to do more research and adjust my timeline for my project. And priorities within the U.S. Forest Service and other agencies can shift really quickly, so it's important to have a backup plan or be ready to take on new challenges. So I found that when requesting information from federal employees, you must ask well in advance, send frequent reminders, because they carry heavy and sometimes unmanageable workloads, and they can't always get back to you as quickly as you need them to. So, just always plan ahead. Don't ask for something last minute. That's really unfair. And it's good to start these communications early on and develop a really good working relationship so that when you need to request something, people will be more likely to make the time to provide you with feedback and other resources. And so, because of federal funding shortfalls, public land agencies are becoming more dependent on grants to fund projects on federal lands. I'm really glad I took this opportunity to expose myself to the exciting world of grant writing because I have a strong feeling that this is only the beginning of my grant writing career. So the next steps, because the initial funding approval and after the work on the ground is completed, the forest will be more likely to be approved for RAC grant funding in the future. This kind of opens the door up for them. And since the Boise National Forest is already working on the agreements, we'll be able to utilize this funding during this fiscal year. The forest needs to continue to seek out grant funding to address deferred maintenance issues that won't be addressed by this funding. And most importantly, this grant funding will help get work done on the ground. But grant writing is a really important skill to have. And as federal agencies continue to utilize this funding, it would be wise for any aspiring land managers to obtain experience and training in grant writing. So through this project, I was able to develop professional communication skills, proficient writing skills, and produce a salient grant proposal. I believe that if more data could be collected to prove that increasing recreational demands require additional funding, more federal dollars could be allocated towards addressing these issues. Until then, there may be opportunities for future MIM students to volunteer to help federal agencies with grant writing and data collection. This would not only help students gain valuable skills and build professional networks, but it could also help them land positions within a land management agency. So my suggestion to MIM students looking for projects within a public land agency is that to work with local managers to plan a project that only meets a master's project requirements, but also addresses the needs of an agency. And
what were the restrictions on the first grant that you were going to apply for that made you think that it wasn't appropriate?
there was, with the first grant, their budget, they had you break down a lot of sections, and there were certain things they wouldn't cover, like transportation, or they wouldn't cover different parts of salary. So there was different restrictions placed on that, and then so we were left with, well, how do we fund that if we don't have the funding, and how do we match that? Because you can't necessarily write a grant for the same thing, so you can't write two grants for the same thing. So that, with this RAC grant, we were able to kind of lump more together, and they were more willing to cover those costs as a lump sum, kind of like we're contracting them, we're going to give them this sum of money, and we're going to, so it was just kind of the way it broke down, and there was a lot of different things they would cover that were necessary to get the work done.
So you addressed this a little bit, but what steps are needed to identify what are the priority trails for limited grant funds, even there's just so much deferred maintenance from lack of resources? What really comes to the forefront when you look for trails to fund these grants?
Well, it's different with this project that I proposed. You know, you'd really look for, you know, trails that have experienced a lot of down timber and that are causing resource damage, or there's erosion issues and sediment loading or other environmental factors, or maybe it's a heavily used trail that people can't get safe access to. So you want to address those, but with this, a lot of these trails, most of these trails haven't been looked at in over 5 years or more. There's just not the funding to get people on the ground to go out there and see what's going on. So this was an attempt to, let's look at some, and I decided, I chose which trails we're going to address. And I looked at a map, I've been to some of them, and I chose one in the same area for efficiency, so it could go from one trail to another. And also ones that I knew were used by the public and that were significant, that were busy trailheads, or somewhere that, you know, was identified that it was a busier area. So it was somewhat random of how I chose exactly what trails we were going to work on, but yeah.
Ryan mentioned in the introduction that your projects look at social and environmental factors. I just wondered if there was anything peculiar about the politics and culture of Central Idaho that influenced your project.
Well, Ammon Bundy is from my radio district. Well, we do get a lot of funding for maintaining motorized trails, and so those issues are being addressed, and that's paid for through registration funding and that grant program, and there are a lot of motorized users in that area, so that is kind of a priority. But there is a big hunting, it is a big hunting area in the fall, and there's also a lot of backpacking and hiking. These trails specifically aren't in the wilderness, so that kind of eliminates that. Yeah, I just got a small little bill for the area while I was there over the summer, but